nationwide. Jack also assisted Senator Jim DeMint in his latest book, Now or Never, Saving America from Economic Collapse. When he isn't busy explaining the constitutional viewpoint on current issues, Jack knows a thing or two about professional wrestling, and I'm sure he would be more than happy to answer a question or two about WrestleMania during the Q&A portion. Years ago, I was a big fan of Jack's work when he was better known as the Southern Avenger. Now, I am glad to know Jack personally and professionally. Please join me in welcoming my former colleague and friend, Mr. Jack Hunter.
It's good to be with y'all here today. It's good to be at the Leadership Institute. I thank Morton Blackwell and I thank Amanda for that very, very nice introduction, and I will entertain wrestling questions if y'all want to get to that a little bit later. My message today, what I want to talk about, we're going to do a Q&A after this is all over. We're going to have a little bit of fun today. Can you hear me with the microphone? Loud and clear? Is one of hope. It's also one of despair. You know, when the Republican Revolution came about in 1994, when Newt Gingrich and his revolutionaries sort of swept into Congress, MSNBC host Joe Scarborough, who was part of that group, part of those sort of young freshman Republicans, said that one of the reasons, the primary reason that he got involved and that he ran that year and that he was part of that group is because our national debt was at $4 trillion. Unfathomable. Nobody could imagine that. $4 trillion. And they were going to do something about that. Well, here we are, nearly 2 decades later, at $16 trillion. And looking at Obama's budget, it could be $23 trillion or maybe more than that. I think it's safe to say that we're heading in the wrong direction. Now, there has been a conservative movement for a very long time. There have been Republicans who have been elected and got into office for a very long time. But government keeps growing. It never gets smaller. This has been a consistent problem. We have plenty of politicians who run for office and call themselves conservative Republicans. And here we are. I use the example of the Republican Revolution of '94 with a $4 trillion debt. And here we are almost 20 years later with a $16 trillion debt. And Republicans were in control for a good bit of that time. Well, by, any measure, if limited government is the measure, and I think it should be, to a large degree, conservatism has failed. Now, that's the depressing part of my talk. The inspiring part, the part that is sort of more indicative of hope, is that I do think things are finally getting better. You know, the term conservative used to be something very unique in our politics. If you go back to the time of Barry Goldwater, or even right before that, to be a conservative was something sort of out there. It was something unique. It meant something special. It meant something specific. Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, Barry Goldwater taught us. He was absolutely right. But at that time, and you could have asked anybody from George Romney to others in the Republican establishment at that time what they thought about that, being conservative was something specific, unique, sort of out there in their view. Well, nowadays, especially in the Republican Party, the term conservative is widespread. Everybody, from the most moderate, or I would dare say liberal Republicans, to the actual conservatives, like to call themselves a conservative. It's good branding. It helps you get elected. But once again, we have a $16 trillion national debt. The federal government is larger than it ever has been. So the term conservative is as popular as it ever was, but actual conservatism still hasn't got the job done. It's important to define what conservatism is in the United States to even begin to think about how we can apply it and actually achieve our goals. Now, there are different types of conservatism and whatnot, but I think the core definition in the United States is what I like to call, and I certainly didn't coin this, the Goldwater-Reagan legacy. The idea that the government that governs least governs best, that, as Reagan said, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. The idea that government is bad. That is American conservatism. And the reason I mention that, it's worth remembering this, it's worth recalling this, if we're actually going to get to reducing that national debt I mentioned and reducing the size of the federal government, as all good conservatives should want to do. Now, Reagan's definition of conservatism, if we're talking about the Goldwater-Reagan legacy, was a three-legged stool. Now, I know this is nothing new to many of the people in this room. It consisted of what he called national security conservatives, people concerned about our national defense. It consisted of what he called religious or faith-based conservatives, people worried about our moral values and concerned about promoting religion in the public sphere. It also consisted of what Reagan called economic/libertarian conservatives. Now, Reagan believed that if any one of these three legs did not exist, then conservatism proper would not exist. Now, we're at a time in our politics right now, from the rise of the Tea Party in 2008 and 2009, and the midterm elections, in which we saw the election of people like Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky against an establishment candidate, or the election of Senator Mike Lee against a long-reigning, what some would consider establishment candidate in Utah. We're seeing a time in which the Republican base is, for the first time in a long time, fed up with politics unusual at a level that they haven't been in prior years. And what I mean by that is, and you saw this in this election, there was no clear Tea Party, explicitly Tea Party candidate in this presidential race this year. Obviously, and here we are, you know, a month from the general election, a lot of conservatives, for them, Romney was not their first choice. I hope he wins. I hope Obama gets out of there, but he wasn't their first choice. The primary process itself was instructive. We saw a Republican base that was very enthused about Michelle Bachmann until Rick Perry got in the race. And they got enthused about Rick Perry until they found out, well, this guy sort of supported TARP and some other things. They were uncomfortable. Then they went to Herman Cain, and they found out that he also supported TARP and some other big government things. And then we went to Rick Santorum, eventually Newt Gingrich. The reason I bring it up, the Republican base kept jumping around. Now, this isn't unusual in a Republican primary, but it is unusual in the sense that I think in election cycles past, they would have been much more willing to settle more quickly. I think the Tea Party base that elected Senator Rand Paul and that elected Senator Mike Lee, that went against the establishment, and that supported other candidates might not have made it and are doing so in this election cycle, desperately want, the conservatives, grassroots, desperately want that limited government champion that conservative Republicans have always promised, and yet so many times, time and again, have never delivered. They want the real deal. Now, back to Ronald Reagan's three-legged stool. To understand where conservatism is right now and how we can move forward, we'd have to understand where we have been in our recent history. During the last decade, most of the last decade, I dare say that Reagan's, talking about his three-legged stool, the national security conservatives were represented very well. The Iraq War and some other things were certainly a testament to their success, despite whatever your opinion might be on that. Certainly social conservatives were represented well. Issues like gay marriage, for example, in 2004 became front and center in that election. I say it helped deliver Bush that election over Kerry that year. Things like faith-based initiatives and other programs that Bush had in mind. But what was missing from Reagan's definition of conservatism during the last time a Republican was in the White House, and for part of that time Republicans controlled Congress? A part of that stool was missing. It was the economic/libertarian conservatives that Reagan deemed essential. There was no limited government conservatism during that time. This was the era of Medicare Plan D. It was the era of No Child Left Behind. It was the era when we doubled our national debt, and we did it under a Republican brand. Reagan believed that conservatism was a three-legged stool consisting of the three parts I just mentioned. There was one part that was completely absent during that time, and it was the economic conservatives who think that limited government matters. Now, what we're seeing right now with the Tea Party and that Republican base, who I think are sort of thirsting, are very hungry for sort of that genuine limited government article at this point, is the re-injection of that third leg of the stool, what had been missing the last time the Republicans were in control. We saw it not only with the rise of the Tea Party in the 2010 midterm elections, but we're seeing it right now, I dare say, with candidates like Ted Cruz in Texas, who took on the Republican establishment there against a lot of big bucks and some pretty name endorsements and turned things around in the favor of limited government. I would dare say we see it in people like Congressman Justin Amash in Michigan. Some people may or may not be familiar with him, but he's a conservative limited government champion who rode in those 2010 elections, part of that Tea Party wave. Richard Mourdock, it looks like Richard Lugar is not going to be having a job anymore. But we're seeing sort of, for the first time in a long time, within the last 2 or 3 years, a Republican base that is fed up and is not going to take it anymore. If Romney wins this election and he becomes president, and we start to see sort of a rehash of what we saw during the Bush years, with maybe he doesn't want to get rid of Obamacare, or maybe some, introducing some new programs that are big government. I don't think the Republicans are going to put up with it this time around like they did last time. It is a different environment. But I think the gentleman here is asking why, because I think we've reached a threshold where people just know this can't subsist. $16 trillion, $4 trillion to $16 trillion in the matter of 2 decades, and people thought $4 trillion was too much. $16 trillion, is it going to be $23 trillion? I'm 38 years old. Is it going to be $40 trillion? Can it be $40 trillion? We've got to start turning this thing around. Now, it is also worth remembering, and I do this not to sort of attack anybody on purpose, but it is sort of worth remembering the mistakes we made in the past so that we don't repeat them in the future. This sort of re-injection of Reagan's third leg of his stool, the libertarian/economic conservatives, that's his phraseology, into the conservative movement, which is necessary. If we're going to get rid of this debt and the size of government, what we have, it is absolutely necessary. We can see sort of promoted by different popular conservative figures in both negative and positive ways. And what I mean by that is, take two figures who are not explicitly economic or libertarian as far as how they're identified by the right, somebody like Rick Santorum. Now, we remember during the debates in this election, Rick Santorum caught a lot of grief when people said, or he said during a debate, sometimes you have to be a team player. You have to take one for the team. Do a lot of people remember that? Okay. Well, within the context of what he was doing at that time as a U.S. Senator, this was passing Medicare Plan D and No Child Left Behind. And here's a gentleman who has said, and there's a lot of things I like about Senator Santorum, but he said, I fight very strongly against libertarian influence within the Republican Party and the conservative movement. So you don't think Reagan's three-legged stool is the proper definition? Here's a gentleman who told TPM, Talking Points Memo in 2006, that he is very proud that the Republican Party is getting away from this idea, this Barry Goldwater idea that government just needs to be small and that we need to think in different terms. Well, no, that's actually always been the definition. Barry Goldwater had it right the first time. Now, I bring up Senator Santorum not to beat up on him specifically, but to compare him to somebody who I think it gets a lot more right than he does, and that's Senator Jim DeMint. Now, Senator Jim DeMint, I'm from South Carolina. One of the things I'm most proud about being from South Carolina is that having Senator Jim DeMint as my senator. Senator Jim DeMint is as socially conservative as I am. He's part of that social conservatism that represents Reagan's three-legged stool. But he also has a completely different attitude from Rick Santorum when it comes to that economic libertarian / leg of that stool. Jim DeMint said this year in this election cycle, just to use an opposite example, quote, I'd like to see a Republican Party that embraces a lot of the libertarian ideas. The Republican Party even needs to start listening to Ron Paul. If Republicans don't understand the important aspects of what Ron Paul is saying, we won't be able to exist as a party, and certainly not a majority party. That was Senator DeMint in January when he was promoting his book, Now or Never. Now, why is that so vitally important? Because Senator DeMint recognizes that economic / libertarian part of Reagan's three-legged stool not only has not existed for a while, but it needs to exist. He understands what so many others don't, and he's lived this example. This is nothing new for Senator Jim DeMint. When Senator Santorum and most other Republicans were going along with the program and taking one for the team by passing Medicare Plan D, Senator Jim DeMint did not support Medicare Plan D. In fact, he was targeted by Bush administration officials. He was told, we're watching your election down there, and if you don't get on board, Senator DeMint, you might have a hard time. He was threatened. And he said, well, you're going to have to threaten me because I'm a conservative. I know what's right here. That's the example we need to follow. And that's the example I think that more people are following within the conservative grassroots than ever before. It's worth remembering the Republicans who got it wrong the first time, and it's worth praising the ones who got it right from the very beginning and following them from here on out. Now, I'm speaking here at the Leadership Institute, which has been instrumental in carrying these conservative ideas forward. I think part of moving forward, whether it's the Tea Party or pushing these who I think are great and exciting candidates like Ted Cruz and others in different parts of the country who will win their races and sort of take these conservative ideas to the forefront and get them done. This is in large part a youth revolution. It's just like, you know, Barry Goldwater in 1964, and Mr. Blackwell was there and knows a lot about this. And a youth at the time. Well, it's funny you should mention that, Morton, because I did want to share, and to close the speech portion of this, and we'll get to a Q&A. I was Ron Paul's official campaign blogger. I co-authored a book with Senator Rand Paul. Was happy to assist Senator DeMint with one of his books. But I'm a traditional conservative. My heroes are Russell Kirk and Richard Weaver and Robert Nesbitt. That's where I come from. But I'm also often mistaken as a pure libertarian because of some of the company I keep. And I don't mind that because I subscribe to Reagan's definition of conservatism. It's all important. I am a social conservative. I am a national security conservative. And I am a libertarian conservative. They're all important. They were also important in 1960 when Barry Goldwater, a lot of those crazy Barry Goldwater kids wanted to get him on the VP ticket that year. I'm going to share with you, and I want you to compare this. You know, a lot of people see these crazy Ron Paul kids and these supporters of Rand Paul, all these young people who are just in love with these libertarian ideas, or von Mises and F.A. Hayek. I want to share with you this 1960 editorial from National Review in which they describe the scene at the Republican National Convention that year as it related to Senator Goldwater. The National Review, 1960. Youth was everywhere at the Republican convention. Youth managed the various candidates' booths. Youth waved the posters. Youth held the convention parade, and it was youth primarily that staged the presidential demonstration Wednesday night. Lots of the young people had no ideological interest. They had come, well, because their family was Republican. But those who were serious, the ones who will be working the hardest to guide the Republican Party in the future, were conservatives, and most of them Goldwater fans. They passed out 15,000 Goldwater buttons, handed out literature inside and outside the amphitheater, and they greeted Richard Nixon at the airport with Goldwater signs, and they did the same thing for President Eisenhower the next day. Now, for my friend Amanda over there, or anybody else who might have been associated with the Ron Paul campaign, that might sound a little familiar to you. The National Review editorial then noted, quote, "They drove one Nixon aide into muttering in exasperation, 'Those damn Goldwater people are everywhere.'" The editorial then concluded of these fiery young conservatives and libertarians in 1960 that those who are serious, the ones who will be working the hardest to guide the Republican Party in the future, are Barry Goldwater fans. Now, of course, we all know that those young damn Goldwater people, those kids, became the modern American conservative movement. And they changed this country, and they changed American politics. Well, I dare say it's happening again. It's not only movements like the Tea Party, but it is sort of this youth upswell that's represented by groups like the Leadership Institute that are going to reclaim conservatism in the way that Ronald Reagan meant it, and are going to push it forward in the way that Barry Goldwater always dreamed it could. I'm very proud to be a part of this movement, and I'm so excited about the future. Despite how much big government we have now, I think we can finally really begin to turn things around. So I thank you for letting me be with you here this morning. Okay, I think we're going to do some Q&A here. Absolutely. All right. And Harmony, I think we've got some questions over here already.
Can we talk about two data points and maybe three? Christine O'Donnell in Delaware, Sharon Angle in Nevada, and maybe Todd Aiken. And in each case, the Republican establishment, whatever that means, abandoned those candidates after they were nominated. What do we do about that? I mean,
well, I think those are different situations in this respect from like Senator Rand Paul or Senator Mike Lee. I supported Christine O'Donnell and Sharon Angle. I don't think in retrospect, and I believe many of my fellow conservatives would agree with me, that they were the quality of candidates that Senator Paul and Senator Lee were. I think that was sort of a learning era for the Tea Party movement in particular, that we don't like the establishment, we want one of our own, we want somebody from the grassroots, but there are different kind of grassroots candidates at the same time. It pains me to no end. I think Harry Reid could have been beaten that year, and I wish that would have happened. Boy, do I wish that would have happened. But at the same time, all things considered, I think it was a learning period for the Tea Party movement, the grassroots conservatives. The beauty and sort of the negative aspect of having a genuine bottom-up grassroots movement is that it is real, and we are serious about limited government. At the same time, we're not as politically savvy as maybe sometimes we should be. So there are pros and cons. Other questions? There's some lady all the way back there.
My question is, can you win without the three pillars or parts of the stool? Because it seems to me that there's some ambivalence between the libertarians who are more interested in individual rights and maybe right to privacy, and the social conservatives, and that the Obama administration is really trying to wedge social conservative
You're asking if the social conservative leg of Reagan's stool can sort of coexist with the libertarian, or if that's your question. Yeah, well, that's sort of the problem. Republicans have been winning, but conservatism hasn't been winning. And I think that's the big distinction. I think sometimes in our partisan bluster we confuse the two, and that's always been a problem. To address your comments, it's interesting. So many of the young libertarians I meet, I would dare say a majority, are adamantly pro-life. I see so many opportunities to sort of push the pro-life envelope right now, due not only in part to conservative efforts that we've been at for a long time, but technology. When I leave here today, my brother's having his firstborn son, and I've been getting these 3D baby apps. Has anybody seen this? It's an application on your phone where they do the sonogram, and it's like a 3D. I wrote a column about this when my sister-in-law first became pregnant. That baby was a baby well within the time that it would have been illegal to have been legal to kill it in South Carolina. I wrote that column, and people who even said they were pro-choice said, no, that's not. I see so many strides that we're taking with the pro-life movement, with the young people. To answer your question, I think revolutions in our technology are going to have more people coming over to things like the pro-life position. I think there was a poll here recently that for the first time a majority of Americans described themselves as pro-life. I don't remember that happening any time in recent history. I think those positions can be taken, not only the abortion issue, but things like gay marriage or however you feel about the federal war on drugs. I think the piece there is by taking a sort of federalist approach, a 10th Amendment approach, a states' rights approach. Senator DeMint has spoken about this a few times as a strong social conservative. It always seems like there's this tension within the conservative movement between the perception that libertarians are hedonistic and just want people to go crazy and do whatever they want, and that social conservatives always want to be in the bedroom. Well, no, if we just follow the Constitution and states' rights, different states can do things like, well, once we get rid of Roe v. Wade, have their own abortion laws, or have their own laws about things like gay marriage, or medicinal marijuana and things like that. I think that's the way you get to that winning coalition that you mentioned. I think that's the only way we can do it. So maybe that's too much of an answer. Do we have another question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks for taking these questions. Rather than the diversity in this three-legged stool, what do you see as a fundamental unity between those three components of the stool? Is there anything that needs to be shared as a fundamental assumption or presupposition or leaning that we can't get rid of in order for the stool to stand?
Well, I think there's misunderstandings between different legs in the stool, as I just mentioned about the social conservatives, the economic/libertarians. When it comes to the national security conservatives, Senator Rand Paul has spoken about this, that he supports sort of a Reagan-esque foreign policy. He always describes it as there are two extremes in our foreign policy, being everywhere all of the time or being nowhere none of the time. a happy medium is probably where America needs to be to maintain sort of our place in the world as far as global dominance and whatnot. He always makes the argument that we are far too much in danger of being everywhere all the time. Now, to the degree that some self-described national security conservatives think it's necessary to be everywhere all the time, or to be in Libya, or to be in Syria, we're going to have problems, because you can't address a $16 trillion national debt, a $1.5 trillion annual deficit, without first addressing entitlements. Everybody agrees on that, unless you're a Democrat. And then addressing what we do overseas, the money we spend. Bruce Fine, who was worked for Ronald Reagan, an attorney here in Washington, D.C., ran the numbers on what the actual money we spent in 2011, based on Obama's budget numbers, related to things, foreign policy, national security, state. It came out to $1.2 trillion. Now, that's not the official number. The official number is always like 600 or 700 billion, but then, you know, during the Bush years, they'd say, well, that's leaving out the spending costs for Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, that's kind of a big spending cost you need to sort of include. To answer your question, to the degree that we begin to understand as social conservatives and economic/libertarian conservatives, to the degree that some of these national security conservatives have sort of gone too far, we can get back to sort of that happy medium that Reagan represented. When Reagan was in office, we were staring down probably the worst menace in the history of this country, other than the Nazis, with the Soviet Union. I mean, we had nuclear weapons in our backyard, and Reagan did not fight any decade-long war during that time. I mean, the Soviet Union represented something far more menacing than anything Al-Qaeda could ever concoct. It's just night and day. But Reagan didn't do anything like we did with Iraq, and we can't afford these things. So I think, you know, conservatives who believe in a strong national defense are going to start to say, well, maybe that doesn't mean we should have an irrational offense with a $1.2 trillion price tag attached to it. And that way we could get back to a better social conservative, a more sane national security conservatism, and finally, thank God, an economic/libertarian conservatism. So, yes, ma'am.
You were talking about history and the foundation of this country, predicated on, I believe, this rugged individualism for which Americans are known. And a lot of us in this room remember a country when that was a good thing to be, to think for yourself, decide for yourself, and take responsibility for yourself. We all know the media is selling a different image, and a lot of people, including people my age, don't feel powerful as an individual anymore and have been conditioned that government needs to do it. How do you chop through that? Morton's doing it on campuses, but I can't even talk to my neighbor who is an entitled person. This cocoon that has been woven, how do you see that as a writer?
Well, first and foremost, I think the Leadership Institute has been instrumental in sort of pushing the ideas out there that individual achievement, individual creativity, and imagination is what really fuels this country. You know, Obama's famous "you didn't build that" comments, I think, made a lot of people wake up that this is how the Washington political elite feel, particularly in the Democratic Party. I do think, I was talking about sort of the youth movement behind a lot of what we're seeing with this new, what I think, genuinely limited government conservatism that's sort of starting to come about. Most of the young people I meet who fuel this and are part of groups like the Leadership Institute do not have that sense of entitlement. They want to be free. They want to be, you know, free to use their creative mind, to be good capitalists, and to do something for this country and be productive. I see a lot of hope in the next generation with that. I really do. I think, you know, hopefully that could spill over to some others as well. But, you know, and maybe I'm looking at it in a wrong way somewhat, but I do see the next generation of sort of carrying that forward. I think if we're going to get rid of this debt, if we're going to shrink government, it's going to come, you know, the old saying, things have to get worse before they get better, where they've gotten worse. I don't want to get too much worse, but they probably will, at least somewhat. You know, good Lord, if Barack Obama wins, well, they're certainly going to get worse. But I think you're going to reach that threshold, that breaking point where people, we can't do this anymore. And individual achievement will mean something again, rugged individualism. So, yes, ma'am.
Thank you for taking my question. You talk a lot about the youth movement, and I really appreciate that. What do you foresee, though, or what do you see that is probably one of the main challenges that the youth have in pushing the conservative movement, and how do you think we should address that challenge?
Well, the main challenge is beating liberal Democrats who are taking us down the wrong path. I think that's for everybody, not the youth in particular. Let's see. I think the youth, as I just mentioned a second ago, understand. The youth don't have the attachments that many of their parents and grandparents do to big government, and I mean that in the nicest way possible. As I mentioned earlier, I'm 38 years old. I don't expect to see Social Security or Medicare. I don't think it's going to be there. I think I need to have some sort of retirement plan. I need to have health care, but I don't think government's going to be there to do it. Now, paying into it forever, we need to do it. We need to fix what we have now. We need to reform. We need, I think, means testing, as many conservatives have suggested, maybe raising the eligibility rate. But that sort of entitlement state, and that's the biggest drag on our debt, everybody knows it, is something that the younger generation doesn't expect. I think even just circumventing that, the idea that, hey, I can do this on my own, it should be private, we should have free market solutions, is a huge step. And I think that crosses party lines. I think a lot of young people who might have been excited about Obama in 2008, who are not as excited this time around, even realize that. I've talked to them, even friends of mine in my personal life who aren't that political and maybe skew a little bit liberal because they're young or whatnot, are like, this is crazy. $16 trillion is crazy. And they don't expect to see those entitlements either. So that's, I think, promising. Not the situation, but the attitude about it. So, yes, sir.
A question about our defense. China has about 400 jet aircraft, 1 aircraft carrier. We've got 11 aircraft carriers and about 3,500 fighter aircraft, jet aircraft. And yet I talk to so many people here and around the country who say, I'm not sure why we really need 11 aircraft carriers and be at almost a 10-to-1 advantage over China. Not that there's any war imminent, but I just want it. As you travel around the country and talk to people, expand, if you would, do you find also people out there who say, I don't know why we need all these people, why we need all these aircraft and aircraft carriers, but I just want it?
Well, that's sort of ties into the debate you're seeing in the Republican Party right now over the sequestration. We've heard a lot about that. Grover Norquist has been excellent on this. He's spoken out against the idea that we're gutting the military, that we're cutting too much. It's the same argument that liberals use with baseline budgeting. It is decreasing the rate of increase. Mick Mulvaney, a representative from my own home state, put this beautifully in an interview with the American Conservative, that the jobs discussion needs to be separate from the national defense discussion. There is no reason on earth why we can't have the strongest military in the world that's ready at a moment's notice to go against anybody who even dares to challenge us at much less than we're spending right now. It's not a question of whether we're going to be weak or strong, it's whether we're going to be financially solvent and still be strong with our military. Rand Paul's budget, Senator Rand Paul, when he first got into the Senate, and Senator Jim DeMint and Mike Lee backed him up on this, and Ron Johnson and Tom Coburn and a few others. Tom Coburn's actually very good on this issue as well. His cuts, it was $500 billion in the first year, which addressed a third of our national deficit, took us back to 2006 military levels of spending. Now, I don't know about you, but in 2006, I didn't feel like America's military was sort of weak or that we didn't have enough. Now, a majority of Republicans at the time did not back up Senator Paul in that budget. They said, we can't do this. This is gutting the military. I had an opportunity to interview my other senator back in South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, during this period, and I challenged him. Senator Graham, I agree with Senator DeMint and Senator Paul that these are the kind of cuts we need. Why did you not sign on to this? Jack, we're not going to weaken our military. He thinks going back to 2006 is weakening our military. We have a problem in this country, and Mick Mulvaney said it great when he said the jobs discussion needs to be separate from the national defense discussion, that we have something called military Keynesianism. That's Mick Mulvaney's phrase as well. I'm sort of stealing it from him, but it's great. We're starting to understand now that Keynesianism in our domestic politics does not work, sort of this idea of stimulus and bailouts and what Paul Krugman talks about. That works for our military as well. What we spend dollar for dollar should be for our actual defense, for kicking anybody's butt who would dare challenge our country, but not for just employing contractors in each state around this country where their congressmen can go to Capitol Hill and say, oh, I've got to protect my piece of the pie. That's not national defense. That's welfare. And Mick Mulvaney has it right, and Grover Norquist has it right, and Tom Coburn has it right, Senator Rand Paul has it right, and Jim DeMint has it right, and Senator John McCain has it absolutely wrong, and Senator Lindsey Graham has it absolutely wrong, and anybody else that agrees with them. If we're going to go the McCain, Lindsey Graham route, we will never cut our debt or deficit. If we're going to start following Senator DeMint and Coburn and Rand Paul, we can finally get it done. That's a big difference. So, how much more time do we have for questions? 2 more? Okay. Back here?
Hello. So, federal announced recently that we're going into QE3 and possibly QE infinity. How do we as voters fight against that when we don't have any direct control over the Federal Reserve?
Printing money out of thin air is not a good idea, and I think Americans from across the political spectrum now understand that. QE3 is scary in the sense, well, they're all scary. QE1 was scary, QE2 was scary, but it is unlimited. It's not a set amount. What can we do about it? I don't know. I don't know. I mentioned earlier that sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. But when you look at Europe and what's happened in countries like Greece, and you look at Ben Bernanke and QE3 and what the Fed's doing, you have to think these people are insane. So I don't have very high hopes for QE3 or anything good coming out of it. I'm actually very fearful of it. So sorry not to have a more hopeful answer there. Let's take one more question. Yes, sir. Right here.
The last question has to be, what's this about wrestling?
Very good question. When I began my pundit career in South Carolina in talk radio, before I got into talk radio, I worked for an FM rock station. And you would hear, starting from about 1999, in between, rock music, you would hear me run my mouth 3 times a week about politics. And at the time, my boss thought it would be funny that I would be an anonymous character and show up at events, and part of that included me wearing a Lucha Libre wrestling mask. Nobody knew who I was. And I am a big fan, so that sort of undercuts anything else I've said here today, obviously. But my friends like Amanda like to sort of poke fun at me a little bit about my favorite pastime and hobby, which is that. So I grew up in South Carolina, Ric Flair, what are you going to do, so. But I so appreciate being with you here today. I thank Morton and Amanda and everybody for inviting me. I love the Leadership Institute, all the good work you're doing, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.